Welcome back to Project 613. Today we review the mitzvah of Ma'aser Rishon, which means to separate a tithe of the produce and give it to the Levites. The verse says, God says that I have given an inheritance to the Levites from the tithes of the Jewish people, which they separate. This is known as Ma'aser Rishon. Now, although we've already studied this mitzvah, we repeat it again today because, as explained on a number of occasions, the daily mitzvah study cycle runs parallel to a more in-depth study cycle of Maimonides' Code of Law, in which he goes through all of the specific details of every single law, not just the general mitzvah. So as long as a certain law is being covered in the in-depth track, we review that same mitzvah again in the basic study cycle which we are following. That said, I'll share today an interesting law from the in-depth track that runs parallel today, and that is that when it comes to this mitzvah of ma'aser, of separating the tithe, the way it works is that the obligation is on the produce as opposed to on the individual, meaning to say that the Torah mandates that in order for an owner to partake of his produce, he first has to separate a tithe, give it to the Levites, and then the rest of the produce is considered permissible for him. So long as the tithe was not separated, the produce is not permissible for him. But the obligation is on the produce as opposed to on the individual. And therefore, say the produce changes hands. So long as the tithe was taken once, that's okay. The next person is allowed to partake of the food. Why? Because the produce was already tithed. The obligation is not on the owner, that each owner has to separate a tithe, unlike by tzedakah, for example, where every individual has to give 10% of their own, and if they get from someone else, they then have to give 10% of that. But when it comes to the tithe of the produce, the idea is that the produce needs to be tithed, and once the first owner tithed it, once he separated the 10%, that if he sells it, or if he passes it on, or if he gives it to someone else, that person is free to go and partake of it and doesn't have to tithe it again, because the obligation is not on the individual, rather it's on the produce. That said, there is a halachic concept where a person would be very careful where he's eating or who he's buying from, to make sure that he's taking produce from someone who's reputable, from someone who is known to have separated the tithes, because otherwise it would be forbidden for him to eat from it. So imagine if I buy something and I don't know if I buy some produce and I don't know if it's been tithed or not, then I won't even be able to eat from any of it unless I tithe it again. So a person would want to purchase or eat by someone who is reputable for separating the tithes to save them from this biblical violation. In halacha, this is called a chaver, someone who is reputable. And here, the halacha rules a fascinating thing, which is that if there is someone who is known not to be reputable, of course, if you purchase from him or if you're eating by him, you then have to go and remove the tithes themselves. However, if it's Shabbat and you have some food in front of you and you are not sure if the food has been tithed or not, if you ask this individual who you took it from, who you bought it from, or who gave it to you, whether or not he has taken the tithe, even if he's in general not a reputable fellow, and he's known that not necessarily he can be relied upon, and therefore usually in the weekday, even if he would tell us that he took a tithe, we wouldn't trust him and we would have to tithe it again. Nevertheless, on Shabbat, we trust him. We take him for his word. Why? Because the halacha rules that on Shabbat, even the non-reputable fellow will not tell a lie. Why? Because the awe of Shabbat has this effect, even on such an individual, that they tell the truth. Here we see the amazing power of Shabbat, the practical power of Shabbat, that halacha recognizes that the energy of Shabbat has an influence even on someone who otherwise would not be trusted. On Shabbat, he would tell the truth, we would rely on him, and we would be able to enjoy the produce. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.